Hey everyone, and welcome back to Joey's Retro Handhelds. I'm Joey, and today we're going to be doing a deep dive comparison between the TrimUI Smart Pro and the Anbernic RG35XX H. You might be thinking, why? Why do this? Why even bother? They are, as far as you can tell, completely different devices, so why would you compare them? And the simple fact is I see this question a lot through Reddit, Discord, and everywhere else, even in my comments. So a lot of people are curious because both of these are basically around the same price range, and a lot of times the TrimUI Smart Pro is cheaper. So why not compare the two and see which one's better for most people? And that's the goal of today's video. Now, the TrimUI Smart Pro has three different color options. So there's the black that I have here, there's a white, and then there's a gray with the purple buttons. Now, color is always personal preference. I'm a big fan of the black as well as the white, but all three are good. For the H, which is what I'm going to be calling this throughout the video, so I don't have to say 35XX H multiple times, there is the transparent purple, and then there's the transparent white, as well as the black. So you have three different color options as well. Personally, I think the white and the purple look the best, and I have the purple here because I had the 35XX original in purple. But again, all three colors are nice. Now let's talk about specs, and in reality, performance-wise, they are actually pretty close, and you'll see this a little bit later on when we do some testing, but general idea, performance-wise, they're both the same. So they can do perfect PlayStation 1, up to PlayStation 1. Anything you can think of, up to PS1, great. Then it happens that you will play some Nintendo 64, some Dreamcast, and some PSP. And we'll get into what some means a little bit later on. But the hard limit for performance on both of these is those systems, so don't expect to play anything further. Although still, I would suggest both of these for PS1 and under, and then you can dabble with N64 and Dreamcast and PSP. Now, where the differences start to happen is the TrimUI Smart Pro has a 4.96-inch 720 by 1280 screen. And it's no contest here. The screen is a lot better than the 3.5-inch 640 by 480 screen in the H. The H has HDMI out, where the TrimUI Smart Pro does not. Otherwise, spec-wise, these devices are basically the same. Everything else is pretty much the same. So you can ignore the rest as long as you know those key differences. Now, at the $50 price range, there is nothing else comparable, at least to me, with the TrimUI Smart Pro. I don't think there's anything as good as it in that price range, and the H as well for a smaller, more pocketable device. But general idea is until you hit the Retroid Pocket 2S, which is basically an improvement on the H in every single way, and kind of an improvement on the TrimUI Smart Pro in every single way as well, except for the screen, the 2S at $100 would be the next step up. So you're kind of doubling your budget there, but you're going to get perfect Nintendo 64, perfect Dreamcast. You could do PSP on it if you don't mind the 3.5-inch screen. You'll play some GameCube and some Wii and some PS2 and all of that sort of thing. But basic idea, these are priced really well at $50. For the TrimUI, it's a little bit different because it's a 16:9 screen. The next step up would be a Retroid Pocket 3 Plus or a Retroid Pocket 4 base. And the 3 Plus you could probably get used for around the same price as the 2S, so around $100. So again, it's double the price of what these are at. Now, are those worth it? In my mind, yeah, I would pay the extra money for a 2S or a 3 Plus. But today's video is on these two devices and this price range, so let's jump a little bit more into it. Now, both of these devices, in my mind, are actually well made, and build quality is better than you would expect, and it doesn't feel cheap. It doesn't feel like it's not quality or it's going to fall apart. So you kind of have that going in. And so if we look at the top of the H, there's the headphone jack here. There's two USB-C ports. There's a mini HDMI port, the F button, which acts as kind of a menu or a hotkey, and there's the shoulders and trigger buttons, of course. The TrimUI Smart Pro has the power button here as well. There's a USB-C port, but it's not the one that you charge from. And there's volume buttons and the shoulders and triggers. Let's stop at the shoulders and triggers part. because for the TrimUI Smart Pro, this is the first major divergence between the two. The TrimUI has awful trigger buttons, essentially unusable in my mind. And I've been told that there's a newer revision with fixed trigger buttons, and I'm not sure how much it makes it better or what they actually changed. I don't have my hands on any of them, so I can't comment, but if you're lucky, you might get one with better trigger buttons, which anything could be better than this. They're essentially just way too small, they take too much effort to push down, and they're just not good for anything that you would use triggers for. Especially since this has Moonlight now for streaming, you never want to use this for a first-person shooter, I can tell you that. Now, the H is fine in comparison because the triggers are just inline triggers, so unless you absolutely hate inline triggers, they're fine. They're good enough for hotkeys, they're good enough for just general use, but you're not going to be praising them at the end of the day, and they're just kind of there. The TrimUI has nothing on the sides of the device, where the H has the volume buttons on the left, and then on the right side you have the power and the reset button. Personally, I prefer the power being on the top, but that's a nitpick. On the bottom, the H has 2 slots for SD cards, so slot 1 and slot 2, as well as down-firing speakers. For the TrimUI on the bottom, there's an FN switch, which confuses every single person. There's a USB-C charging port. There's a mic input, but I don't think this actually works, and SD card slot, as well as a headphone jack. Now you might be wondering, where are the speakers on the TrimUI? And you might be thinking they're at the front because you see little speaker grills on the front of it. And the answer is yes and no. The speakers are actually in the middle back of the device, and they're not at all anywhere you would be normally putting them. So they're not down firing. The audio barely comes out of that front, and it's not really speaker grills in that way. They are actually, you hear them more from the back than you do from the front. So audio on this device is not very good, put it that way. Now, as far as this FN switch, it is something that you can change in the software, and basically you want it to be on the right, so away from the FN button, and then in the software you would enable performance mode. And essentially what this switch used to be was a battery saver mode, and then they changed it because a bunch of reviews got it wrong, like Russ and a bunch of others. And essentially the idea is nowadays you want to leave it to the right, and then in the software you want to change it to performance mode. But either way, I have a full setup guide if you're curious on the TrimUI Smart Pro that you can check out. Now on the front, we have the usual suspects. There's the D-pad, there's the buttons, there's all of that. The TrimUI has a dedicated menu button right here on the bottom left, and it's a lot better than the menu button being on the top. There's still so many times where I go to turn off the H, and I'm pushing that menu button and realizing the power is on the right. It's just one of those weird perks that come with the H, but either way, I love having the menu button on the bottom left, and it's awesome to have it there, right available to you. However, the TrimUI does get the start and select buttons wrong because they're on the one side. So that's a bit of an annoyance, where it's a lot easier on the H because start and select are on opposite sides and more natural feeling, I think, to most of us. Now we're really going to get into the weeds here, and a lot of this upcoming is going to be my opinion, but the D-pad on the TrimUI is leagues better than the one on the H, in my opinion. It's a joy to use. There's a lot less false diagonals on it, but it is smaller than the Anbernic D-pad, so just keep that in mind. But if I'm playing PS1 and under, this is the D-pad that I want to use. And you can tell doing the Pokemon test, there is no false diagonals here. It is a really good D-pad for that. Now, for fighting games and all of that, it might not be the best, but I think for general D-pad usage, this is the one that I enjoy the most. Now on the H, the D-pad is more of a traditional D-pad, but it does come with the false diagonals and all of that. I think most people wouldn't have an issue with the one on the H, except for it's kind of a little sharp in some ways. It's not exactly a rounded D-pad like the one on the Plus. This is actually a different D-pad than the one that is on the Plus, but either way, more traditional. On the buttons end, it's kind of a tie to me. The H has more travel to them. They're more traditional buttons. They're taller and all of that sort of thing. But the TrimUI Smart Pro has clickier buttons. They're a bit smaller, but they feel more like kind of Xbox style, where they're just clicky. They're just normal clicky, not a lot of travel and all that sort of thing. Then we come to the sticks, and the sticks are another major divergence between the two devices here. The TrimUI Smart Pro has beta sticks on here, and there's no nice way to put this, these are among the worst sticks that I've ever used, and I absolutely hate using these sticks in any game that I have to play on the TrimUI Smart Pro. There's no L3 and R3, so you kind of lose that functionality as well as that option for hotkeys. But I will say that after you calibrate them in the software, they do get a lot better. You have to do that every time you flash firmware or anything really, so just remember to calibrate them if you have one, but other than that, they are just not good sticks. Now, in contrast, the H has normal switch sticks, and while I don't like switch sticks, these are leagues better than what the TrimUI Smart Pro has. So, at least on that front, they're usable. Now, maybe controversial Joey thought here, but the main reason that I don't care much about the sticks on the TrimUI Smart Pro, or even the H for that matter, is because I consider this as a PS1 and under device, or both of these are PS1 and under, in which case you're not using the sticks in a lot of cases. You're going to use the D-pad and the buttons. And so if you look at it from that perspective, I couldn't care less what the sticks do because I don't use them. So it all depends on what you're going to be using these devices for, and we'll get into performance in a little bit. Now, from a comfort and ergonomics perspective, and when I say that, I don't mean picking it up for 5 minutes and putting it down. I mean using it for a good period of time. So the TrimUI Smart Pro probably has one of the better comfort and ergonomic designs that I've experienced on handheld. So I would consider this probably a top 5, at least in my mind, of comfort ergonomics. It feels really good to hold for a long period of time. And you could just play this for hours without hand cramps or anything like that. Now, in the opposite end, and a lot of this has to do with the size of the H, but I just don't find it very comfortable at all. I could play good half hour in spurts with this before I get hand cramps and just not really enjoying it after that. And so it just becomes a little bit more of a pick up and play burst device to me on the H than the TrimUI Smart Pro. And at least that's how it feels to my hands, my feeling, and all of that. Now, we talked about this before, but the TrimUI Smart Pro has a 4.96 inch, so 5 inch, 16 by 9, 720 by 1280 screen. And it just completely destroys the H. The H has a 640 by 480 IPS 3.5 inch screen. There's a lot more, obviously, that you can do on the TrimUI because of the bigger screen. And Nintendo DS games is a perfect example because you don't have to split it between screens. You don't have to keep pushing a button to swap screens. You could just show them both on the TrimUI. Or Game Boy Advance. You have a lot more screen real estate with Game Boy Advance games than you do on the H. But even from colors and all that sort of thing, the TrimUI is just better. In my mind, for under $100, even though this is really in that $50 price range, there isn't a better screen that you can get than the TrimUI Smart Pro. Now, audio-wise, the H sounds a lot better than the TrimUI Smart Pro because of what I mentioned before. The speakers are hidden somewhere in that TrimUI and not in a spot where it sounds good, where the H at least has them down firing, and so they're a lot better. Let's have a quick listen to both of the devices. Now we get to software, and this is where things get a little wildly different. Let's start with custom firmware. And right now, for the TrimUI, you have Tomato OS, thanks to Tech Toy Tinker. Tomato OS adds a bunch of emulators, it adds ports, and a bunch more on top of stock. So it's meant to go on top of it. It's not a replacement. For the H, there's a few. There's EmuOS, which is my personal favorite. There is Batacera, and there's also a modified stock which allows you to extend the partition, and it has a few more emulators and things like that. So you have a few different options. Overall, custom firmware-wise, the H wins out, and it's going to win out because it's using the same processor that's going to be used in a lot of future Anbernic devices. So more custom firmware is going to be developed for those devices, and so you'll get more options for you. Now, why that might not matter is because the TrimUI Smart Pro's stock firmware is actually pretty good. I know a lot of people want emulation station and that sort of front end and all of that, but if you can give that up, the TrimUI Smart Pro actually has a decent software. Whereas in my mind, the H isn't great for software, at least on stock. The TrimUI just got an update that added Moonlight streaming, as well as Bluetooth audio, and Vulkan support. And Vulkan support's big for a device like this, and we're going to see it improve as we go along. Right now, it's kind of beginning stages, so there's a lot of bugs and things to work out. But as we go along, it's only going to get better and better. Now, one absolutely amazing feature of the TrimUI Smart Pro that outcompetes basically any other Linux device that I can think of, and that's the sleep mode. The sleep mode on this actually works. It goes to sleep and your battery doesn't die like it does on an H or a Powkitty or anything else. When you put anything else to sleep and you come back a day later, your device is dead, or it's half battery or something like that. When you put this to sleep, it acts as like an Android type device where you lose a little bit of power drain, but otherwise you can just pick this up and go. You could put this to sleep and come back a day later, 2 days later, and just continue. Whereas the H and other devices, when you put it to sleep, it is not an actual sleep mode. It is a fake sleep mode that just kills the battery. One absolutely not amazing feature of the H is there's a static hiss or noise that plays every time that you open a game or close a game. And if you're very susceptible to noises like this and it bothers you, it's going to drive you nuts. And it's basically just a low static noise. And you can't get rid of it. It still happens on custom firmwares. It's just something to do with this device, and it's going to keep happening. So if little noises like that bother you, little static noises that play every time that you open a game or close a game, then you're not going to like this as an option. I think overall, as a software comparison, I think stock is better on the TrimUI Smart Pro, but for custom firmware, it's going to go to the H. And it'll be up to you to decide which one matters more. Let's take a look at some games now, and I'll give you an idea of what the PS1 and under games look like on the TrimUI Smart Pro, just so you have an idea of how much the black bars matter, if they do to you. Personally, they don't matter to me at all, but some people, it does. So here's a quick example of what games look like with the TrimUI Smart Pro. Now, for Nintendo DS, the TrimUI Smart Pro is going to come out ahead. And the simple fact is it's got a bigger screen, and you could have both Nintendo DS screens on at the same time. Whereas for the H, you're going to be pushing swap screen constantly, especially for games where that matters. Now, neither of these have touchscreen, so you can't just use it for touchscreen. You're going to be limited to the games for DS that don't have that, or where you could just use the cursor in an easy way. Now, the TrimUI Smart Pro also, in my mind, comes out ahead for Game Boy Advance games. And you can see a quick comparison of how good Game Boy Advance looks on the TrimUI Smart Pro compared to the H. And I don't think it looks bad on the H, it just looks fantastic on the TrimUI. But otherwise, there's no point in comparing PS1 and under on both of these devices. They both run them perfectly. So let's talk about everything above PS1. Now, before we get into Nintendo 64, I need to mention a very specific issue to the TrimUI that affects it. There are a lot of N64 games that for some reason just will not boot on the TrimUI Smart Pro. And initially I thought they were just ROM hack issues, and some of it is, but games like Mario Tennis, for example, will just not boot on the TrimUI Smart Pro. Or you're going to see an example in our showcase of a game that has a lot of texture issues, and it could just be a settings thing, but I'm trying to go with the out-of-the-box experience for both of these, and you'll have an idea of how that looks, but I think from a compatibility perspective, the H at least wins out on N64 just out of the box. So Banjo-Tooie is the example here of a game that for some reason on the TrimUI Smart Pro out of the box is having a lot of issues with textures. And there could be an easy fix for this. Again, I'm trying to do the out-of-the-box experience here. And for some reason, Banjo-Tooie, not good. On the H, it runs perfectly, so there's no issues there. Something to do with the TrimUI Smart Pro. But on the opposite end, if we go and boot up Super Mario 64, the TrimUI Smart Pro has no issues. It looks perfect. On the H, it looks like Mario went and became a geisha. Something is going on there. Mario is doing some things. Now, thankfully, the fix for the H is actually very easy. All you have to do is change the core that it's using, and suddenly Mario is back to being his normal self, and everything is right. Then we jump into Mario Kart 64, and they're basically the same here. And surprisingly, they both have the same performance, so there's no real difference between the two. And I did some other testing and comparing the both, and the general idea is for games that actually do run on Nintendo 64, for both of them, performance is essentially the same. So it really comes down to that compatibility and the sticks and all that sort of thing that makes the difference. And it's kind of the same idea with Sega Dreamcast and out of the box. Using Crazy Taxi here as an example, and I'd give a slight edge to the H, but in general, they're both very similar performance-wise. Despite what the frame rate actually shows at the top, the feeling of both devices is kind of the same to me gameplay-wise. Lastly, for PSP, out of the box, stock firmware, the TrimUI has an advantage, of course, because it has a 16:9 screen, and that matches the PSP, but it also has an advantage going forward for performance thanks to the Vulkan edition. And that just basically means that in the future, not right now, it will be better. It's kind of a little bit buggy at the moment with Vulkan, so I'm not going to suggest it, and we're going to be using OpenGL here. Now, I had to disable frame skip because the H was using that out of the box, and so I had to get these both on the same level playing field. They're using the same settings. If we boot up Gran Turismo, which is typically a hard game to run, you can see that, yeah, it is very hard to run, and neither of these devices run it well. Then we jump into Jak and Daxter, and it's more of the same. It is not great on either device. It is pretty choppy. If you turn on frame skip, it helps a bit, but now the game just doesn't feel good. And it kind of continues as you go along into other games. The general idea that I kind of want to leave you with here on performance is both of these are basically the same performance-wise for any games that actually run. You can go in and start tweaking them and get good performance on Nintendo 64, on Dreamcast, on PSP. You can go in and do all of those hacks. Now, for the normal person, the person that's probably watching this video, I don't think you would fall into that camp. So if you're trying to buy these devices and you want to buy it for Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast and PSP, just know what you're getting into. I think overall, the H would probably come out ahead for compatibility and just stability and all that sort of thing, but I still don't think either of these devices is a good choice for Nintendo 64 and above. I said it before and I'll say it again. If you want a device that's similar to the H but can do N64, Dreamcast, and PSP, then the Retroid Pocket 2S is your best option, and I still consider that as one of the best devices that you could purchase. Now on the flip side, if you want a device that's similar to the TrimUI Smart Pro in design, the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus or the Retroid Pocket 4 Base would be the next options here, and you could find a 3 Plus for pretty cheap used, and that would be a good option as well. If you're curious what those look like, I have the 2S on screen, and you can see the same games that we just played and how well that it plays it in comparison, just to give you a quick idea of the gap between the two devices. And then in the same way, I have the Retroid Pocket Flip, which is the same processor as the 3 Plus, so same idea for performance and screen and all of that, and you have a good idea of what that looks like as well. Now the 2S and the 3 Plus have basically the same processing power, so not much difference performance-wise between the two, so you have a good idea of what that looks like on screen. Let's do some final thoughts here and just wrap everything up. I'll let you come to your own conclusions, of course, after watching everything, because there's some things that might matter more to you than it does to me and all of that. But I don't think that there's a clear winner between both of these devices. I don't think there's an easy answer when you're looking at comparing both of them in general scenarios for a general person. Now, for me, the better screen, the better ergonomics, the better D-pad, the better comfort, and all of that makes the TrimUI Smart Pro a better choice for my uses. Because I see both of these devices as PS1 and under, I just like using the TrimUI Smart Pro more than the H. It's a better experience for me. Plus, that static noise on the H really drives me bonkers. But the H is smaller, it's more pocketable for a lot of people, and the triggers actually work. You could use the sticks. There's a lot of good when it comes to the H, especially when it comes to custom firmware options and all of that sort of thing. So it's not exactly an easy cut and dry decision between the two. So to end it off, for me, I would go towards the TrimUI Smart Pro. For you, maybe the H, but I mean, you can't go wrong with either decision. Do you want a small screen? Do you want a big screen? I think we could leave it at that. And with that, I'm going to end the video here as well. Let me know in the comments below what you think, or which one you chose, or if you bought both. Do you agree? Do you disagree? What did I miss? Don't forget to like and sub to help the channel grow, and hope you all have a good one.